We are recording. Okay, today is March the 11th, 2021. Okay, we have gotten down to, instead of the intertestamental period, down to the Hasmonean house. And Hasmonean is derived I think we've talked some about this, and because things overlap when you're looking at the political and the culture and so forth, and we talk about over and over these. And so it's derived from the family name of Mattathias and his sons who belonged to the house of Hasmon. And it is by this name that the Maccabees are known in later Jewish history, but it's convenient to reserve the expression Maccabee for Judas and his two brothers, and to use the title Hasmonean to describe their descendants. And there's five in number, under whom Jews experienced almost 70 years of independence, 134 to 63 BC. And in the 63 BC is when the Roman Empire began. For a short time during the reign of John Hyrcanus, he reigned, that'd be Hyrcanus number one, and that'd be 134 1 to 104 BC. So Judah became a vassal state, but independence was regained to extend his territory in the south. For example, he seized Idumea and compelling the inhabitants to be circumcised. And so in the north, he seized the Samaritan territory and destroying their rival temple on the Mount Gerizim. I think we made reference to that also. But these acts on part of Hyrcanus showed that he had obvious religious ideas, but during this whole period, there was a growing discontent, chiefly among the Hasidim and the Orthodox Jew generally, with the Maccabees and also with the Hasmonean house. Not only had they taken over the Maccabees and the Hasmonean house, not only had they taken over the high priest, they had become increasingly worldly and irreligious. So by the time that John Hyrcanus, the growing breach between that of Judaism and has materialized into two parties. We talked about these, and they keep coming up. We'll talk about them all the way because we talk about them all the way through the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's the Pharisees and Sadducees. And so first, Hyrcanus sided with the Pharisees, and we talked about some of that. But when one of their number demanded that he should relinquish the high priestly office, he broke off with them and joined forces with the party of the Sadducees. And so Osterley points out that one of the chief priests' reasons why the Pharisees are opposed to Hasmoneans was that they spoke of themselves as king, although they were of the lineage of David. He indicated that even Hyrcanus assumed that this royal office, whether this was so or not, and Josephus gives the information that his successors, Aristobulus the first, 103 BC, was first to take the title of king, although this is not indicated on his coins. And so this fact, together with his support of the Sadducean party, his love for Greek culture, and the fact that he was implicated in the murder of his mother and also his brother, Antigonus, roused the antagonism of the Pharisees even still more. So matters, however, came to head, and so the time of his successor, and that was Alexander Jannaeus, 176 BC. And at the very outset, he greatly angered the Pharisees by marrying the widow of Aristobulus, although it was unlawful for a high priest to do this. Moreover, he neglected his spiritual office and actually devoted himself as a warrior. He needed his spiritual office and devoted himself as a warrior, conquest, and to aggrandizement by means of war. He used the title king, announcing the fact on his coins in Greek as well as Hebrew characters, thus revealing his attachment to the Greek way of life and demonstrating a further stage in secularization of the high priesthood. His unpopularity with the people is illustrated by an incident which took place on one occasion, the Feast of the Tabernacles, with complete unconcern for the responsibilities of his highly priestly office. He purposely flouted ritual requirements by pouring out the water libation on the ground and not on the altar. So incensed were the people. So incensed were the people about that they pelted him with the citron and which they had brought with them for the use in the ritual. So, in a fit of temper, he gave orders to his soldiers, who slew many of the Jews within the courts of the temple. And at a later date, the situation became so bad, civil war broke out, which lasted for 6 years. And so, when at last peace was restored, it is reported that he caused 800 Jews who had opposed him to be crucified. So this stops for a moment and helps us to understand this was before 63 BC. And so we hear so much about the crucifixion was the way of the Romans putting people to death. But here we find before that is taking place. So during the rest of his reign, the Pharisees and the Orthodox remained quiet, but so powerful was the Pharisaic party, becoming that of Janus, here to the end of his life. He saw it in a great danger to the royal house. So he went to his wife of Alexandria, and was appointed queen by his command to consolidate them by giving them more authority in the state. So when Alexandria, when she took office, 75 to 67 BC, she came to the throne on her husband's death. She acted accordingly and appointed her son, Hyrcanus II, to be the Hyrcanus was favorably disposed toward the Pharisees and by his influence, so they grew considerably in strength. And with the increased civil and religious power in their hands, they were able to impose their own views on the people. And so, in particular, they made matters very difficult for the Sadducees, that is, the opponents of the Sadducees, who found a champion in Alexander's younger son, Aristobulus, who made it clear that he was intent upon gaining the throne. And so, on his mother's death, Aristobulus gathered an army to defeat his brother near Jericho. Hyrcanus was forced to give up office, and Aristobulus, 66 to 63, became king and high priest, so remaining in power to 63 BC. And so again, like I said before, we stop sometimes and we think about when we look at the heathen people back in the Old Testament times, is how that they would go around killing one another, get everybody, kill everybody that was in the line to be the next king, so they could be the king. We wouldn't think that would be true in reference to this idea of the king and the high priest, but yet we see that between the Testament, that's the case. And so the story of the Hasmoneans draws to an end with the account of one Antipater and the governor of Idumea, who encouraged Hyrcanus in exile to remove his brother from office. And so with the help of the Arabian ruler, Artas III, he besieged Aristobulus in Jerusalem. And it was at this point that Rome decided to interfere in the Palestinian affairs. Again, we have to notice that Aristobulus became king and high priest 66, but 63, and that's when the Roman Empire. So in the year 63 BC, Pompey in person, hearing the designs of that of Aristobulus, attacked Jerusalem and conquered it, entered into the person and the temple and the Holy of Holies. And Aristobulus was carried captive to Rome. Hyrcanus was confirmed in the high priesthood and was appointed ethnarch of Judah, which was now added to the province of Syria. So here's Rome now, as they're becoming the empire. And so now they've taken that of Jerusalem and they've added it to the province of that of Syria. So that brings us to the point about the Herod and the Romans. And this is probably where we would have started, but yet we want to start back some to make sure we keep our mind upon where we are. Because in 63 BC, the Jews lost their independence when Pompey was again brought them under the yoke of the heathens. And so from that time forward, the spirit of Judaism, Jewish nationalism sprang into revolt and continued right down to the destruction of Jerusalem and the Jewish state in 70 AD. And so the years following 63 BC were very troubled ones, indeed, whose complications can only be lightly touched upon. Antipater was the name whose name is prominent in Jewish history for the next 20 years. So that would carry us down to 43 BC. And so, but at first gave strong support to Pompey, but in 48 BC, when Pompey was overthrown, he transferred his support to his rival, Caesar. Now, as a result, Caesar granted very considerable privileges to the Jews, not only in Judea, now also in a dispersion. So we get back again, and we're going to talk about the dispersion. We bring it up. It's brought up in First Peter, and also James. And so we're going to talk some about that later. But this was part of the plan that God had, the eternal plan that God had, that for the gospel to be spread, then the Jewish people had to be dispersed, and they were dispersed, carried out from different countries and so forth. And so we're going to talk about that. And we've already made reference to Acts chapter 2, 8 through 10. I think that's right. 8 through 10, 8 through 12. All the nations that are there were dispersed. They come from those that dispersed to Jerusalem to worship. And so that's the part of the idea, is that 3,000 people obeyed the gospel. And so these people would return to their homeland. So that is their home places, and where they had actually taken up some of the Greek culture. The Koine Greek was the language, and the synagogues were built, and so they would go back to those. They accepted some of the Greek culture ways, as I said, and so you had the Gentiles, and there was maybe a little closeness to that because of their accepting Greek culture, but yet there was a great distinction between them. So we'll get into that because of this, and so Antipater was bitterly hated, though. In spite of all the benefits accruing from his friendship with Caesar, he was bitterly hated by the Jews, no doubt because of his very dependence upon Rome and because of his being an Idumean, that is, he was an Edomite. And if you'll call, you can go all the way back to the book of Obadiah and all the way back to the history in reference to that, and you'll see how the Edomites and so forth, and how that they fought against that of the Jewish people, Israelites. So this hatred for Antipater intensified when, after the death of Caesar in 44 BC, the proconsul Cassius came into Syria, and with the utmost severity, he exacted heavy taxation from the people. In the following year, Antipater was by his enemies. And again, that was a way to get rid of them. But when Anthony came to power after the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC, he made Antipater's two sons, Fassel and Herod, tetrarchs under the ethnarch Hyrcanus II, whom he confirmed in the high priesthood. Now, I'm going to stop there, and I want to go over to the Gospel of Luke. I want to say that it's chapter 2, and Mark. It's very interesting because he's brought this up in our study, and we find in chapter 3. This up. It says, now in the 15th year, and that would be 29 AD, of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, and Tiberius Caesar died March the 16th in 37. So we would find that Pontius Pilate, being governor of Judea, and Herod, he'll go from 4 BC to 34 AD, being tetrarch of Galilee, his brother Philip be a tetrarch of Iturea and of the region of Trachonitis, and Samias, the tetrarch of Abilene. Annas and Caiaphas, being the high priest, the word of God came unto John, the son of Zacharias, in the wilderness. Now they're the high priest, so we know John started basically around around 27 AD in his preaching and teaching. That's when Christ started, and John the Baptist was before that. So John the Baptist was 6 months older, as we would probably say, than that of John the Baptist. John the Baptist 6 months older than that of Jesus the Christ. So you get the picture of what's going on here in reference to what Anthony done, and making Fassel and Herod tetrarchs under the ethnarch that of Hyrcanus II. And so whom he confirmed into the high priesthood. Serious trouble laid ahead, because Antigonus, son of Aristobulus, Asamonean, gained the support of the Parthians. Now, again, you go to Acts chapter 2 there, down in verse 8, you'll find the Parthians who upheld the claims to the throne. So Asa and Hyrcanus were taken prisoner. The former committed suicide, as Fassel did, and the latter was taken into as Hyrcanus. And so Herod, however, escaped and made straight for Rome. He secured an interview with Antonia. I keep saying Anthony, but Antony. I always thought that was Anthony, according to Julius Caesar. So, but anyway, there, much to his own surprise, though, he was appointed king of Judea, 40 BC. So he had still, however, the face to face Antigonus, who had taken possession of Judea with Roman help, though he defeated his rival in 37 BC. So it was about 3 years. Siege of Jerusalem, and Antigonus was put to death, and the reign of Herod the Great began. And we have to remember Herod the Great because there's going to be some other Herods after that. But under Herod, 37 to 4 BC, now this is Herod the Great, and his sons, the policy of Hellenization went on apace. And so he wanted, if at all possible, to be everything to all men. To the Jews, a Jew, to the pagans, of pagans. And so his marriage to Mary Amy, the granddaughter of Hyrcanus, was an indication of his desire to please the Jews, as was, for example, his building of the new temple at Jerusalem. So he began in the year 20 BC, but even this could not reconcile the people to his Idumean birth and to his plans to Hellenize the kingdom. So in one important respect, though, he alienated many of his Jewish subjects. In the Hasmonean dynasty, the high priest and the king were one. Now Herod, being an Idumean, could not be high priest. So he had to make it his policy as much as possible to degrade the office of high priesthood. And so with this in view, he broke the hereditary principle on which it had been based and abolished the life tenure of the office. Therefore, the high priest was appointed by him and held office just as long as it pleased the king. So the policy of Hellenization on which Herod embarked was due in part to, at least, to the very nature of his kingdom, which contained many Greek cities and numbered many Greeks among its citizens. So he had sometimes been called a patriot of Hellenism. And this title can be fully justified in a number of respects. For example, he made little use of the Jewish Sanhedrin. And in its place, he set up a royal council on Hellenistic lines. And he replaced the old hereditary aristocracy by a new aristocracy of service and graded this new class according to Hellenistic practice. So his policy of administration of the nature of a strongly centralized bureaucracy was pursued also along that of the Hellenistic lines. And the historian Josephus tells us that he appointed solemn games to be celebrated every 5th year in honor of Caesar and built a theater at Jerusalem and also a very great amphitheater in the plain. Now, if we go down and we're going to read Josephus, he says, on this account, Josephus says, and it says, on this account, it was that Herod revolted from the laws of his country and corrupted their ancient constitution by the induction of that of foreign practices, which constitute yet ought to have been constitution, yet ought have to be preserved irreviewable, by which means we became guilty of great wickedness after a while those religious observations were used to lead the multitude to piety, were now neglected. First place, he says, for the first place, he appointed solemn games to be celebrated every 5th year in honor of Caesar, built a theater at Jerusalem, and also a great amphitheater in the plain. But he says both of them were indeed costly works, but opposite to that of Jewish custom. For we had no such shows delivered down to us fit to be used for or exhibited by us. Yet did he celebrate these games every 5 years, and in the most solemn and splendid manner. He also made proclamation to the neighboring countries and called men together out of every nation. And notice what he says. He says the wrestlers. So we stopped there, and Greco wrestlers. We used to hear that a lot. You don't hear that now in the kind of wrestling that we watch on TV or you watch on TV. Talk about they wrestled, and so wrestlers and the rest of those that strove for the prizes in such games were invited out of every land, both by the hopes of the rewards there would be bestowed and by the glory of victory to be gained. So the principal persons that were the most eminent in these sorts of exercises were gotten when they were gotten together, or there were very great rewards for victory exposed not only to those that performed their exercise naked, but to those that played the musicians, and also were called Thymelixes, and he spared no pains to induce all persons, the most famous for such exercises, to gain this contest for that of victory. Now that's what Josephus tells us, and he was a literal supporter of the Olympic Games and was declared in the inscriptions of the people of Elis to be one of the perpetual managers of the game. Now Josephus goes on in Antiquities 1653, section 149. He says, and as to the Olympic Games, which were in the very low condition by reason of the failure of revenues, he recovered their reputation and appointed revenues for their maintenance and made that solemn meeting more verbal. They're near venerable. As to the sacrifices and the other ornaments, and by reason of this vast liberality, he was generally declared in their inscriptions to be one of the perpetual managers of the games. So they liked it because of what he was doing. So in his extensive building operation support the contention that he encouraged the cult of the emperor, for all the many temples he built throughout Palestine were dedicated to Caesar. And so the Pharisees in particular were horrified when they learned that Herod had actually permitted pagans in his kingdom to erect statues to himself. So we read of certain things, and of certain men were the successors of the early Maccabees who entered into a holy covenant to hinder him, even on the pain of death, from perpetuating his policy of alienation. Even when they captured and tortured and put to death, they were others who were ready to take their place. So they were willing to stop it. They didn't care, if they would die for them. So following the death of that of Herod in 4 BC, tumults broke out in Galilee, which were from this time forward was known as the hotbed of Jewish nationalism. Josephus tells us in 1 that Judas the Galilean, who in association with Zadok the priest rebelled against Rome and founded a new sect in 6 AD. And so this is presumably the party later to be known as the Zealots, Greek or Canaanius in Aramaic, or Sicaria in Latin, so which was to be a thorn in the flesh of the Romans for many years. Now, if we were to study about the Zealots, we would find, and I think this is interesting and more interesting to me now because of our study of the Between the Testament, that when you stop and look at all the apostles, you have to stop and ask, where were they from? Were they Pharisees, Sadducees? Were they connected to the Herodians? Were they connected to the Zealots? Some of them were. I think one of the passages talks about him being a Zealot, another calls him a Canaanite. So that's interesting to me. So the rebellion in Galilee was put down with bloodshed by Herod's son, Archelaus, 4 BC to 6 AD, who succeeded him as governor of Judea, only to be banished 10 years later by the Romans as the results of an appeal against by the Jews and Samaritans. Now, notice that, the Jews and Samaritans. Here we find 4 BC and 6 AD that the Jews and the Samaritans are making an appeal for the same thing. Apart from a short period of 3 years in which Herod's grandson, Agrippa I, 41-44 AD, ruled as king in Judea, the country was governed by a succession of Roman procurators from 6 to 66 AD. And 66 AD, Rome, you'll recall Nero says that, the Christians burnt 64, I think it was 64. I don't remember the dates. That was around that time. So during the whole period of this Jewish nationalism was increasing in intensity and found a particular dangerous expressions in the activities of the Zealots, who regarded the foreign rule of Rome of the Romans as an intolerable situation. So these activities were motivated not simply by political aims, but also by deep religious convictions. So for this, it would seem that the Zealots regarded themselves as the true line of succession of the early Maccabees. It is interesting to recall, as we said, that at least one of Jesus' disciples belonged or had belonged to this party. His name was Simon the Zealot, Luke 6 and verse 15, and Acts 1 and verse 13, or Simon the Canaanite, Matthew 10:4 and Mark 3 and verse 18. It has been argued that others may have belonged also, such as Judas Iscariot, Judas Iscariot. From Latin, it means the Latin Sicarius, an assassin. So since Bar-Jonah from Achaean and Bar-Jonah, a terrorist. James and John, the sons of thunder, Mark 3, verse 17. And on one occasion, Paul was thought to be a zealot, Acts 21 and verse 38. And Jesus himself was brought into association with the leaders of the zealot movement by the teacher in Acts 5, 34 to 37. Jesus was not a zealot, but no doubt certain of his fellow Jews and the Romans thought of him as in the passages. It says in Luke 6 and verse 15, Matthew and Thomas and James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon called Zelotes. Acts 1 and verse 13. And when they were coming in, they went up into the upper room where abode both Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, and Thomas, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, James, the son of Alphaeus, and Simon Zelotes, Judas, the brother of James. I just stop for a moment and think, since they become disciples of Christ, and if they're all, say for instance, this is a mixture of the Pharisees and Sadducees and Zealots and all the other different factions of that of Jews, if the apostles were, we don't know for sure about all of them, but we do know some. And how did they get along? They got along very well. Why? Because they were disciples of Christ. They left all of those other things. Matthew 10:4, Simon the Canaanite and Judas Iscariot who also betrayed him. Mark 3:18, and Andrew and Philip and Bartholomew, Matthew and Thomas and James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus and Simon the Canaanite. Mark 3 and verse 17, and James the son of Zebedee and John the brother of James, he surnamed Boanerges, which is the sons of thunder. In Acts 21:38 says they're asking Paul, Aren't thou that Egyptian which before these days made us an uproar and lead us out into the wilderness, 4,000 men who were murderers? And he was a zealot, that person had done that. In Acts 5 and verse 36, he says, then stood there up one in the council, a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a doctor of the law, had a reputation among all the people, and commanded to put to death the apostles forth a little space, and said unto them, you men of Israel, take heed to yourselves, and what you intend to do is touching these men. For he said, before those days, or these days, rose Thaddeus, both himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who were slain, and are all, as many as obeyed, were scattered and brought to naught. After this man rose up Judas Galilee, and in days of taxing, and drew much very people away. He says he also perished, also even as many as obeyed. He says they were dispersed. And so when we stop and think about what they're saying there, we find that here is this movement, the leaders of the Zealot movement. Jesus himself was brought up in association with those. That's what he's going to go on to say and talk about that of Jesus. If this is a true movement, then you're not, and it's from God. He says you're not going to stop. And so couldn't stop. So the Zealots were essentially men who were zealous for God. They were the agents of his wrath against the idolatrous ways of the heathen. They believed that they were called by God to engage in a holy war against the powers of darkness. And in this, they shared the convictions of many of the patriarchal Jews, including the coveters of Qumran. We talked about them. There's not much about them, but we have to remember they are a Jewish group, just like the Pharisees and Sadducees, Zealots and the Herodians. Indeed, in this respect, apart from the collaboration, it's the Sadducees. There's at times no clear line of demarcation between one sect and the other. And even when we stop and think about it, Josephus, who is anxious to isolate the Zealots and to put on them along the blame for the Jewish war, on at least one occasion links Zealots and the Essenes together, and as we have seen, association them in their origin with the Pharisees. So in other words, if we were to outline that, so we're going to talk about the Pharisees, point number one, then up under there we said, well, we got to talk about the Zealots, and point number two there, we've got to talk about the Essenes, because it would seem as if that Josephus is saying that they were basically from these. So their patriotism was no doubt more obviously expressed than that of others, and their zeal of God made them only ready to wield the sword as a divine appointed instrument of salvation. But as Dr. W.R. Farmer says, he puts it this way, he says, when the showdown came, the whole nation would be caught up in the life and death struggle between God's people and their enemies. Every patriarch Jew, whether he be a Pharisee, Essene, or Zealot, would be called upon to give his full measure of service in the holy war. So the same writer also remarks that the Zealots were no doubt considered by many of their patriots as overzealous and a bit trigger happy. So in comparison with other parties in the land, what is certain is that they did much to set off the war with Rome, which raged from 66 to 70 AD and ended with the destruction of Jerusalem and the entire Jewish state. So only once more, that would have been in the year of 132 AD, was an attempt made to strike a blow for the independence of Judaism as a revolt led by Ben Koshba, commonly called Bar Kokhba, aided by the influential Rabbi Akiba. 3 years later, the rebellion was crushed and Jerusalem was refashioned as a Gentile city. So we find the struggle between Judaism and Hellenism was over, and to all the appearance, the battle had been lost. So, but just as Hellenism could not be resisted by force alone, so Judaism could not be slain by the powers of arms. So the Jewish state fell, but Judaism prevailed. And for when conquest was denied and compromise forbidden, unlike Christianity, which went out into the Hellenistic world to outthink and outlive and outdie the pagans, chose for itself the path of separation. So this momentous step was taken by one Johanna ben Zakkai, who, when the battle was raging for the life of Jerusalem just before its fall, set off the town of Jamnia on the Palestinian coast, and there founded a school which was to mark the beginning of a new era for the Jewish people. They no longer had Jerusalem, they no longer had the temple, but there at Jamnia, they had the study of the sacred law of God, and that to them was more than life itself. For this, their fathers had fought and died. Their sons, for this, their sons would live. So that brings us to another portion of our study in reference to that of between the Testaments, and that's the people of the book. Now, here again is that struggle between Judaism and Hellenism described, as we said, last chapter there. Cannot be explained with reference to the desires of the Jewish either for the political freedom or religious freedom. But indeed, the struggle went on even when political freedom had been gained, and religious liberty, in the sense of each man's rights to follow the dictates of his own conscience, would not have been tolerated by the Jews. Throughout this period, writes Dr. T.M. Manson, the Jews were fighting not for such modern ideas as this, but for the life of Israel, where Israel is a complex organic whole, which indicates the monotheistic faith, the cultus in temple and synagogue, the law and the custom embodied in the Torah, the political institutes which had grown up in the post-exilic period, claim to ownership of the Holy Land, whatever dreams there may have been of an Israelite world rule to supersede the rule of the Gentile empires. So these word comes up that sometimes we have heard the new order of things contained in these ideas, from which Judaism was willing to fight to death and had already found expression near the beginning of the 3rd century BC in some words of the high priest Simon the Just. In the Jewish tractate, Perky Aboth, and I sent that to you, Jim. It is written there. He used to say, on 3 things the world standeth: on the Torah, and on the temple service, and on doing of kindness. He says, if you drop down a little bit in the notes, there it is in reference to what he says. Perky Aboth, Simon the Just, was the last survivor of the great synagogue. He used to say, upon 3 things the world rests: upon the Torah, upon temple service, and upon the doing of acts of kindness. And so these 3 things actually represent revelation, worship, and sympathy. That is simply saying God's word to man, man's response to God, and man's love for each fellow man. And so, and all right, one and the same type of rule of life and foundation of that of the nation of this and state of Israel in pre-Maccabean days. The temple stood as a bulwark against the tide of Hellenism, but as we see, Chelsea, the rallying point for the forces of Judaism came more and more to be the eternal and sacred Torah. So that brings us to Torah religion. Dr. D.L. Moore, he defines the word Torah as the comprehensive name for the divine revelation, written and oral, in which the Jews possess the sole standard and norm of their religion. The word signifies instruction or teaching, and it indicates the revelation given by God to Israel through his servant Moses. So the word is often translated law, but this can be misleading, for its meaning is nearer to revelation than it is to legislation. But since this revelation finds written expression in the Pentateuch, and the name Torah is commonly applied to the first 5 books, or the 5 books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's what I've always been taught, what I've always in other places have read. But as we shall see, the name can be applied not only to the written record of this revelation, but also to the unwritten traditions, which sought to have explicit teachings, which was implicit in that of the writings of the written Torah. Now, we have to remember sometimes we talk about the tradition of the Jews. So those things were written also. They did have their traditions, and so like we have traditions. But throughout the whole period, from Antiochus IV, 175 to 166 BC, 3 BC, Vespasian, 69 to 79 BC, and Titus, 79 to 81 BC, Jewish nationalism was rooted and grounded in the Torah. Now, within this word lay the germs of revolt, which were to spell death to Hellenism and all that the foreign culture stood for within the Jewish nation. And also, so the book, the vehicle and expression of the Torah became increasingly the sign and the symbol of their faith. Now, we have to remember that Vespasian comes in as that of the Caesar that during the destruction of Jerusalem, and Titus is the one that brought about the destruction of Jerusalem. He was the general, as we would say. And so they still, even after the destruction of Jerusalem, the Jews still tried to live by that of the Torah. The only thing is that the temple was destroyed. They could no longer go there and have sacrifice. And not only that, but the genealogical tablets proving that they were a Jew were also destroyed. So we need a discussion from that of the temple to the Torah. This phrase does not permit us to tell the story of Ezra, according to the Talmud, founded the Torah long after it had been forgotten, and only brief mention can be made of the Sophirium or scribes, who, according to tradition, carried on the work of Ezra by teaching and interpreting the Torah to succeeding generations, claiming for it a position of supreme authority within Judaism. Their teaching was based on simple exegesis of the Torah, out of which new traditions would arise, from which there had been no precedent in the ancient store of tradition or in the Torah itself. Well, they added. If we had the time to go back, and it's a good study to Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther to read and study those. A very good, great study. But we find so many things, and he talks about the scribes there. The scribes were people who simply wrote the law, copies. And so those scribes of the Old Testament make copies of the Old Testament. We have scribes in the New Testament do the very same thing. So the part played by the oral teaching of the scribes was a very significant one, and did much to prepare the people for troublesome years which were to follow, in which the influence of Hellenistic culture began to make itself very deeply felt. So there is a reason to believe that the Sophirium, that is the scribes, what they had written, the Sophirium organized weekly gatherings, not only in Jerusalem, but in the towns and villages round about, in which the Torah was publicly read and explanation of it given. So it would be a mistake to think of these gatherings in terms of the synagogue service that subsequently grew up and spread rapidly throughout Jerusalem and a dispersion. But they undoubtedly prepared the way for them, and the Sophirium and their successors is due much for the credit of the development of this vitality among the institution within that of Judaism. So see, we would think of that here it is, the dispersion. They all went out, and then they built the synagogues. That's what we're most are told. But what brought the building of the synagogues was because of these individual groups that were meeting and they were studying the Torah. So eventually it gathered in the terms of that, it would the synagogue service, but it eventually grew out of that. So on the death of Simon the Just, about the year of 270 BC, the influence of the Sophirium came to an end. There is evidence that after that day, a body of men, chiefly laymen, that is the members, continued to apply themselves private to a study of the Torah. And so this period of unauthorated teaching continued till about 196 BC, when it was probably brought to an end by the organization of what later came to be known as the Sanhedrin court, with both priestly and lay members, which applied itself to the regulation of religious affairs. So long before the time, now the Maccabean revolt, common people had grounded in the faith, and had been taught to apply their religion to their everyday life in the new situations and conditions that are developing in Palestine. I think that's a good thing that we need to learn in America, because of what's taking place in our country, that people need to be grounded in the faith. And so the Torah became increasingly the focus of their attention, and gradually came to mean more and more in the devotional life of many who, by reason of the troubles of the times or by reasons of the dispersion, turned from Jerusalem, from Jerusalem, I got too many words there. Their dispersion from Jerusalem were unable to offer sacrifice in the holy temple. Now you have to stop and think about that. That is the case, and it was the case. They couldn't go there. Then AD 70, when it was completely destroyed, and it's been destroyed, and it's not been built back. That is still a problem today. Somewhere then between the completion of Torah, about the middle of the 4th century BC. Now you have to remember they translated the things from that of the Hebrew and Aramaic into that of the Greek, as we will come up again. But between this completion of the Torah, about the middle of the 4th century, that would be BC, and the Maccabean revolt in 167 BC, there took place a subtle transfer of emphasis from the temple to the Torah, which was yet to be momentous for the life of Judaism. But it is in the Maccabean period age that this transfer is more noticeable, most noticeable. For by then the Torah had become the visible symbol of the Jewish faith. Triumph of the Maccabean revolt, the development of the synagogue and the schools, both in Jerusalem and in dispersion, would further enhance the reputation of the Torah, because that's what they studied in their schools and also in the synagogue. The synagogue Torah was in no way opposed to the temple ritual. It fostered a deep personal religion, something which the temple rites were unable to do. So there came a time when the written record take the place of the cultic acts and the affections of the people. And so this explains why, on the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, that Judaism was yet able to survive. It did survive. The temple had been replaced by a reverence for the Torah. The priest had given way to the rabbi. The temple was supplemented by the synagogue. And so Judaism thereafter was to be essentially a religion of the book. The book of the Torah. Now, does that not help us to understand why that when Jews obeyed the gospel of Christ, thinking, and the Romans thinking it's a part of that of Judaism, that here they were wanting to hold on to what the Torah had taught them. That is what they found in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You don't see them trying to hold up anything else from there all the way to the book of Malachi. Don't get me wrong, they used the Psalms and things of that sort. They stuck with what was in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. They talked about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That was their forefathers. They talked about them, about circumcision. That's where it was enacted 430 years before the law of Moses. So we see, how that this influence. So the rallying point of the revolt, the centrality of the Torah for the movement of the Jewish nationalism, can be amply illustrated from both from the Seleucid and from the Roman periods, in each of which it became the rallying point of the revolt. When Matthias, for example, at the time of Antiochus IV, defied the might of the Syrian at Modin, he cried aloud to the people, "Whosoever is zealous for the Torah and maintaineth the covenant, let him come forth after me." 1 Maccabees 2 and verse 27. Knowing that this devotion that they had toward the Torah is surely very significant indeed, that despite the fact that the temple had been desecrated on a short time before, 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verse 54, it was not the temple, but the Torah to which defense and support of the people were summoned. We support the Torah, he says. An appeal to the temple would have rallied a section of the people, but an appeal to the Torah, a greater chance of rallying the whole people. And even if Not all responded. All were involved, for the whole nation reverenced the Torah as the declared will and revelation of God. From the last, first to the last, right, Dr. Travis Hereford, the struggle was between Hellenism on one side and the Torah on the other, and the final results was that Hellenism was routed and the Torah left supreme, more or less acknowledged by everyone and openly challenged by no one. Now, again, I'm going to quote, go back and read these two passages from Maccabees. It says in 1 Maccabees 2, verse 27, and Mattathias cried throughout the city with a loud voice, saying, whosoever is zealous of the law and maintaineth the covenant, let him follow me. Now, we said Torah, that was their law, remember? That was their law. 1 Maccabees 1 and verse 54, now the 15th day of the month of Caslu, in the 50th and 4th 140 and 5th year, 145th year, 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built the idol altars throughout the city of Judah on every side. That's what the Maccabees say. First Maccabees 1 and verse 54. But now, just stop for a moment again, bring ourselves right into Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jesus then is he's crucified, and all of a sudden the gospel is being preached. Who's the biggest problem in reference to that of the church? And that would be Judaism. And what did they have? Oh, yes, they still had the temple because it had been rebuilt. Herod had rebuilt it, but they still had the Torah. Therefore, they appealed to the Torah over and over and over again. So the enemies of the Jews were quick to recognize the reliance which they put on the Torah and the enthusiasm with which they rallied to its defense. And so the written Torah became the focus of their attack upon Judaism. Concerning the persecution of Antiochus IV, we read in 1 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 56 and 57. Down and read it. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law, which they found, they burned them with fire. And whosoever was found with any of the book of the Testament, or if any committed to the law, the king's commandment was that they should put him to death. So to attack the Torah was to attack Judaism itself. To defend the Torah was to defend the faith of their fathers. Now, what were they doing when the Hebrew Christians were telling the Gentiles, you got to obey circumcision? That goes all the way back to the Father, the book of Genesis. And you got to keep certain holy days and sacrifice. That goes to the law of Moses. Now, the circumcision goes to the law of Moses also, but it goes all the way back to the Father. And so here you see, if they were going to attack, and they were attacked in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that was to attack Judaism itself, and to defend the Torah was to defend the faith of their father. Now, last night we talked about in our Bible class at Cartersville, Georgia, about the things that were missing, things that were done away with in the book of Hebrews, like the priesthood, how it was done away with. If the priesthood has been done away with, then there's got to be a change in the law. Because Jesus Christ becomes our high priest, and he's not in the lineage of that of Levi. He's in the lineage of Judah. So, but you can make the connections when you begin to look at all of this and see why is it that these Pharisees and Sadducees and all these other Jewish sects, why is it that they're so proud of and want to hold on to that of the Torah? And that's the reason why. They're trying to defend the faith of their fathers. So the Maccabean revolt began and continued and ended then in a summons to rise in defense of the Torah, which was to the Jews the very embodiment of their religion. The challenge of the Hellenism was not simply a matter of politics or aesthetics or morals or culture. It was a blow struck at the very roots of the Jewish faith, which found expression in the sacred Torah and so had to be resisted with all their. So, but as we have already seen, the Maccabean revolt, though it won a great victory, did not settle this issue of Judaism versus Hellenism. For all, it didn't. The Jewish nation was still surrounded by Hellenistic culture and had somehow to work out its relations to its environment. Throughout the time of the Hasmoneans, the development of the synagogues and in the schools, in both of which teaching was given in sacred Torah, helped greatly to counteract the infiltration of that of Hellenism. Influences began again to assert themselves in more blatant forms and had to be resisted. So the battle had to be fought all over again. And once more, the Torah was to be the rallying point of the revolt. Josephus, for example, he's writing to the Jews who oppose the Hellenizing policy of Herod. He speaks of that undaunted constancy that showed in the defense of their laws. I'm going to go down and read. He says in Antiquities 15:8-4, section 291, it did not the obstinacy of the people and the undaunted constancy they showed in defense of their laws made Herod any easier to them, but he still strengthened himself after a more secure manner and resolved to encompass a multitude every way, that such implications should end in an open rebellion. That's what they were afraid of. Again, if we were to stop and think about what's going on, we turn to the New Testament and we begin to read how the country is broken up and different governors and all that type of thing. But yet they have to answer to that of Rome, and yet they did not want a rebellion. And if they had a rebellion, the Rome would come down on them very hard. And so these words may be taken as a true description of that of the attitude of the Jews to the Romans right through this period and up to the destruction of that of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Again and again, Josephus tells how they were willing not only to fight and kill for the Torah, suffer and die. And so the destruction of the temple was a great thing, but also the destruction of that of the genealogical tablets were very important. But they were willing to defend the Torah. After the destruction of Jerusalem, they continued to do. As the case of the Seleucids, so also is the case of the Romans. The enemies of the Jews were quick to see that the center of their loyalty laid, and so attack after attack was launched against the Torah. It most significant that among the trophies from the Torah was which Titus carried with him in triumphal processions in Rome was a copy of the Jewish Torah, and that behind it was carried the images of Nike, Greek goddess of victory. So the Torah is here regarded as the supreme symbol of Judaism, over which the forces of Enlightenment Hellenism was believed and had prevailed. So the Holy Covenant, this zeal which the Jews shows for the covenant, for that of the Torah throughout the whole Hellenistic period, was, however, not simply a zeal for a book, but rather for the covenant to which the book testified. And that's the same with us. You have people tell us that we worship the Bible. No, the thing of it is, it's a covenant, New Testament covenant. Therefore, yes, we are very loyal to that. But a covenant made by God in which he had set the Jewish nation apart to be his particular or peculiar people. To despise the Torah was to betray the covenant which God had made with their fathers. This helped to explain the fanatical loyalty which many Jews showed to the rights of their faith throughout those troublesome days. Now, I've often wondered, about go over the book of Hebrews where he talks about how that we are crucified Christ of flesh because of falling away, falling away from that of the truth. And the reason for that is because we've fallen away from the covenant that Christ has given. You look at circumcision, for example, was a visible sign that a man was a member of the covenant. In a number of Maccabean passages, First Maccabees 1 verse 48, he says that they should all leave their children uncircumcised and make their souls abominable with all manners of uncleanness and profanation. Profanation. And yet, not only that, they were to so submit to uncircumcision was to deny that covenant altogether. First Maccabees chapter 1 and verse 15. Eat swine's flesh was to do what the Torah forbade, and so must be resisted on penalty of death. First Maccabees 1, 62 and 63. Second Maccabees in chapter 6 verse 18 and chapter 7 verse 1 for stories of outstanding heroism. The Sabbath was equally a mark of the covenant which Hellenism sought to profane. Second Maccabees 6:6. So strictly did the Jews observe it that many of them chose death rather than lift up arms, even to defend themselves on the Sabbath day. We'll read those passages. I'm going to drop down and read the passage there in the notes there. It says, First Maccabees 1:48, that they should also leave, they were told also to leave their children uncircumcised and make their souls abominable with all manner of uncleanness and profanation. First Maccabees 1:15, and make themselves uncircumcised and forsook the holy covenant and joined themselves to the heathen and were sold to do mission. Chapter 162 and 63, howbeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confirmed in themselves not to eat any unclean thing. Wherefore, they chose rather to die, that they might not be defiled with meats, and that they might not profane the holy covenant. So then they died. Now stop again and think about that. Paul writes to the Corinthians, Paul writes to the Romans. There's a problem with eating meats and so forth. We see how that was ingrained in reference to them. I mean, they were willing to die. They was trying to get them to eat pork. Have a pork chop for supper tonight. No, they died. Chapter 6, 2 Maccabees, verse 18, Eleazar, one of the principal scribes, an aged man and of a well-favored countenance, was constrained to open his mouth and to eat swine's flesh. Chapter 7 and verse 1, it came to pass also that 7 brethren with their mothers were taken and compelled by the king against the law to taste swine's flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whips. 2 Maccabees 6 and verse 6, neither was it lawful for a man to keep Sabbath days or ancient fasts, or to profess himself at all to be a Jew. Chapter 6 and verse 11 there, it says, and others that had run together into caves nearby to keep the Sabbath day secretly, being discovered by Philip, and were all burnt together because they made a conscience to help themselves for the honor of the most sacred day. And in chapter 2 of 1 Maccabees, verse 29 and 30 should be, we find that then many that sought after justice and judgment went down into the wilderness to dwell there, and both they and their children and their wives and their cattle became afflictions, because afflictions increased sore upon them. So we see what happened among them because of what they actually did. And so Torah was uncompromising in its prohibition of idolatry in any shape or form. And so the bitter hatred of the Jews for anything that savored of the cult of the emperor, hence also their violent opposition to those buildings in the Greek style decorated with idolatrous figures of animals and men, and even the trophies which adorned the theaters were looked upon by many as images, and so were anathema to the Jews who worshiped a jealous God and who would look no rival to his throne. So the place which the Torah held and still holds in the life of Judaism is well summed up in these words of Dr. H. Wheeler Robinson. He says, the law was the charter of Judaism, the real source of its strength through the many centuries. The institutions which is enjoyed were in large measure brought to an end in 70 AD. But the law showed its power by the creation of new Judaism, able to endure without land, city, or temple. So now you stop just for a moment and think about what he just said. Then you find out that he just simply points out to us that they need no longer to worship at the temple. And they couldn't because it had been destroyed. But yet they think that that's what God would want them to do. That is not what God wanted them to do. Through the reading of the law, supplemented by that of the prophets and the scattered synagogues of the dispersion, the knowledge of the one holy God and his covenant with Israel kept fresh in the hearts of all. But yet we would find all that had to take place, because what was going to happen is simply that Jerusalem would be destroyed in AD 70, and therefore they could not worship in that of the temple anymore. But what had been going on for 40 years, basically, it started in 30 AD on the day of Pentecost, was the preaching and the teaching of the gospel. What went on 3 years before that was the work of John the Baptist and the work of Jesus the Christ, the 12 disciples, the apostles, and also the 70 disciples that went out. So you had about 84 preachers going out preaching to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And then on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2, we find that the gospel was preached for the very first time by the apostles. And so we find that even though that Dr. Robertson tells us that the law, the reading of the law and supplemented by the prophets and scattered in the synagogues of the dispersion, the knowledge of one holy God and his covenant was with Israel was kept fresh in the hearts of other people, and it was. But yet that's a complete change from that of the Torah. You go read the Torah in that of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, you find that what Dr. Robertson said is contrary to what the Torah had taught. But yet that's what they had done, because they could no longer worship in that of the city after 87, and plus it had been done away with when Jesus died upon the cross. Now our next point is, and we're going to stop, the Torah and the sects, S-E-C-T-S, sects, the different ones. We're going to talk about all those Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and the parties that are founded by Judas and Zadok and the Zealots and so forth. We're going to talk about all of those. Hey, let's take a break.
I see you in a few minutes.